So hello, everyone hear me? Great. So it's my very great pleasure to welcome everyone to Violence, Spectacle, and Psychoanalysis, Jacqueline Rose in Conversation, and a happy Bastille Day to all. So I'm Rebecca Ariel-Port. I'm a member of the core faculty at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, and we're very glad you're here. So I want to give you a sense of the shape of the event before we start. I think it will be on the shorter end, but sweet. And if all goes as planned, we will leave both ourselves and you wanting more, which is always the desirable outcome. So we will have the opportunity to speak with our panelists, Jacqueline Rose and Danielle Drury, both about Jacqueline Rose's varied and capacious life in thought, and about a little bit about the kind of most recent thinking that she's been doing. So the Brooklyn Institute is a sort of critical graduate school for the masses. We began in New York City and now we are based throughout the world. Danielle and Jacqueline come to us from London, and Danielle is currently teaching a course devoted to Rose's work. So we really want to highlight the activities of our London branch, which is now holding classes online and soon we hope in person. And we'll talk here for about an hour about Rose's work in literature, psychoanalysis, and theory over the arc of her career, about sexuality, maybe about Sylvia Plath, about motherhood, about trauma, about violence, and much, much more, I'm sure. And we will leave a little room at the end for Q&A, and we're banking on about an hour, give or take, of conversation. So if you'd like to participate in the Q&A, please do leave a comment in the boxes below the Facebook Live where this is streaming, and they will be collated and we'll try to get to some of them towards the end. And now for introductions. So Jacqueline Rose is one of the world's leading feminist literary and cultural critics. She is co-director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Humanities, co-founder of Independent Jewish Voices, and a fellow of the British Academy. Rose is a frequent contributor to the London Review of Books and The Guardian, among many other publications. And she is the celebrated author of Sexuality in the Field of Vision, The Haunting of Sylvia Plath, Women in Dark Times, and Mothers. Her new book is on violence and on violence against women. Danielle Drury received her MA in Comparative Literature from Tel Aviv University and her PhD in Hebrew and Judaic Studies from New York University. She's taught courses on literary theory, modern Jewish literatures, nationalism and gender at the University of Oxford, New York University, and the City College of New York. Her writing has appeared in several academic and popular publications, including Proof Texts, Deber, Popula, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. And I come to you as a member of the core faculty here at the New York office of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, where I specialize in literature and philosophy. So I want to begin actually with Danielle, I think, in order to begin our conversation. So the question is both simple and difficult, and it's why teach a class on the work of Jacqueline Rose?
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you very much, Jacqueline, for joining us today. I should say that I first got to know your work some time ago as a student of early Zionist thought, and it was a revelation, your use of psychoanalysis for understanding the very structure of a political movement that was also crucially a literary movement. But this doesn't really answer Rebecca's question. And I'm almost tempted to ask you, as an answer to this question, what it feels like to be the subject of a seminar-style course. And this will be, a question about authority, or how you feel in relation to authority. Paradoxically, one of the reasons for choosing your work as the topic of an entire course at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research is your resistance to authoritarian modes of reading literature, culture, the societies we live in. I think that your use of psychoanalysis as a repository of ideas for understanding culture and society has meant that as a thinker, you always remind your reader that mastery of anything, from our own thoughts to other people, to entire nations, mastery is a sort of dangerous illusion. You know, Freud famously stated, and I think you quote him in your work sometimes, saying that the ego is not master in its own house. And so in drawing so extensively on psychoanalysis, your work is often about what we don't know or what we cannot master. And it may seem odd to argue that the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research is not about the production of knowledge, but I actually want to introduce to the conversation, and again, this is still an answer to Rebecca's question, a distinction that you make in this new book on violence and on violence against women. You make a distinction between the production of knowledge and the production of thought. And you follow Hannah Arendt, whose work on violence also lends the book its title, in distinguishing between knowledge and thought. And this distinction reminds us as readers that thought does not necessarily produce knowledge, but rather generates more thought. And I think the reason we've decided to dedicate a course to your work is, you know, our interest as an institute, my own interest in the ways in which thinking works, you know, what it takes in as forms of knowledge, what it rejects, how it can be voluntary and involuntary, how it needs others to be moved. And of course, your work is a type of other that moves thinking. So teaching a course on your work, of course, implies ascribing authority to it. And we do, but it is an attempt to dismantle through thinking authoritative narratives about literary representation or nationalism, sexual identity, race, and of course, violence, which is the subject of the new book. And that leads me to my first question about this book, and about how thought functions in it, especially in your discussion of sexual harassment as a much too common form of violence in the workplace and beyond. So the book connects violence and thoughtlessness or self-deceit, that absence of thought. And you write, and here I'm quoting you, thinking acts as a brake on the fantasy that the world is there to be mastered, and thereby prevents that dangerous fantasy from doing untold damage. But thinking also features as a cruel demand in your analysis of sexual harassment, when you note that the person who harasses demands not only sex, but also thought, you know, seeks to sort of exert control over someone else's thinking, which means that harassment is not only an event of physical or verbal violence or both, but also an act of invading, of forcibly occupying someone else's thought. So this is the question: what is the difference between the kind of thought that acts as a brake on that fantasy of complete knowledge, of mastery, and the kind of thought that the act of sexual harassment demands?
Whoa. Okay. Well, let me just start by saying how much I appreciate being invited by you both to be part of this discussion. I mean, it's very generous of you, and I like very much the way you began, Danielle, because you start off by saying that I have a life in thought, as if you're granting to me the form of being in the world that I think is most crucial and most under threat. And I think we have to start by just I'll get to your question, I promise, but it feels important to start by acknowledging the ways in which certain types of thought are under threat. So during the pandemic, for example, which is what we're all living, there is a kind of deluded denialism from somebody like Bolsonaro, which is a refusal to countenance what's happening. And also the belief that that refusal to countenance it makes us immune to the process. So he famously said, you know, it's the epigraph to the book, in fact, we are going to fight the virus, but we're going to fight it like fucking men. And he also said, my people are so resilient, they could bathe in sewage and not get infected, which is such a deranged statement to make. Plus, if you look at, for example, Hong Kong, or indeed China, or various places around the world, India, Brazil, America under Trump, the culture wars in the UK, there is a lid being put on certain types of thinking. So just to give you an example, Priti Patel, our Home Secretary, and Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, just in case you didn't know, right, both refused to condemn the crowds booing the football team when they took the knee at the beginning of the whole tournament. And their refusal to do that is seen as having instigated or given license or a dog whistle to the racism that followed. And they will not acknowledge institutional racism. It's sort of unthinkable that we could be an institutionally racist country. So, of course, psychoanalysis is about the unthinkable. It's about what we cannot bear to countenance in our conscious minds, but which is thinking us, which is going on despite us. It's going on even when we think it isn't, right? But there's something else that has to be said here. You talked about authority and what it feels like to be in a position of authority, one which I always try and undo as much as possible. But of course, if you take Lacan's 4 discourses of the master, the university, the hysteric, and the analyst, the master and the university are very close. It's one turn of the screw to move all the pieces around so that you're in the discourse of mastery. If you're at the discourse of university, which is to say that authority is very hard to shed, right? It's like Lacan saying somewhere, we don't know. But of course, he's then said, I know we don't know, right? So it's a bit like the paradox of the Cretan liar. I am lying. There's no way to parse it without making it come out that he's telling the truth. Okay, so it's a bit the same. Yeah, I know that I don't know means that you know. I mean, there's no way around it. So psychoanalysis is trapped in that, or Lacanian psychoanalysis is trapped in that. Of course, Freud said there were 3 great narcissistic blows to the narcissism and the ego control of mankind. The first of which was Galileo, which said that man was not the center of the universe. The second one was Darwin, who said we are not the origin of our own species. And the third one is the one you quoted, Danielle, which is we are the ego. Psychoanalysis. He was never modest, Freud, right? Psychoanalysis is the 3rd great revolution after Copernicus and Galileo and Darwin. Along comes Freud. We are not masters in our own home. So psychoanalysis is about mastery like nothing else in a way. But that links to politics. And I just want to mention this because of your work on nationalism and on Hebrew Judaic thought and nationalism and Judaism and so on, and Zionism. And I was on a panel once organized by a group called Intelligence Squared. And what they would do in Chelsea and Kensington, which was a relatively conservative venue, they would hold these public debates. And the one they asked me to be present on was Zionism is the enemy of the Jews. And I said on 2 conditions. One, that you say Zionism today is enemy of the Jews. And secondly, that you get an Israeli speaker to support the motion, because I'm not doing it on my own. It would be wrong for me to support it on behalf of Israel. There's got to. So they, in the end, to cut a long story short, they got Amira Haas, who is a fabulous, radical Israeli journalist. And she stood up and she just said, all of this depends on whether or not you want to be master or not. She said, that is the crux of what's going on in Israel, is whether you want to be master. So this is just to say the ways in which your introduction, Danielle, sparked off so many thoughts for me. But to go to your precise question, somebody has written to me to point out that in the introduction to the book, I make a typo or I just copied wrong or it was a significant slip. And Hannah Arendt does not say in The Human Condition, page 5, all I'm asking is that we think about what we are doing. What she says is, all I'm asking is that we think what we are doing. Now, we could spend the next hour discussing the difference between those two statements, but I think it's significant that I made that mistake, because for me, think about means pause for thought. Before you act, think about what we are doing. Think before you act. Think as an alternative to act, or certainly as an alternative to action that is too confident of its own genesis and its own outcomes. Okay? Think what we are doing seems to me to have a much larger, it has the first meaning, think, just stop and think. But it also means think what we have done, as in, for example, destroy the planet, create modern slavery. So it has both the question of thought and the question of social responsibility, I think, are more tightly bound in the version that is the correct version. And of course, I've written immediately to them to say, please correct this for the paperback. It's absolutely crucial that we get this right. The example I give in the book of thought versus violence is Oscar Pistorius, who insisted when after all the other defenses, which were crumbling one after the other, he said, I did not have time to think. I shot because I did not have time to think. And he was hoarding guns. There was a delivery of armaments due in the house the morning that he killed Reeva Steenkamp. He was obsessed with guns, and he would also go down to sort of shooting ranges and shoot melon heads off and stuff like this. So violence was an intrinsic part of his personality, you might want to say. But in the courtroom, it's one of many moments where he just ties himself in knots. He says, I did not have time to think. But then he also says, if I had wanted to kill the person behind that door, I would have aimed higher, which means that he was thinking when he shot through the bathroom door, right? So there's no way around it. So it's thinking as in mean, dangerous calculation, but there's also a kind of thinking which maybe would have stopped him shooting 4 times through a locked bathroom door, which meant the person on the other side was going to be dead. And this became the core of the defense and the prosecution. Did he know what he was doing? Was it dolus eventualis, which means, was he aware that by shooting 4 times through the door, he might kill? Now, as far as he was concerned, if it was an intruder, then he was justified in shooting 4 times through the door. But of course, what's emerged from the case is that if it was an intruder, the intruder would be black, or it would be fantasied as black in a white man's imagination, because that's how the crime statistics distribute themselves in South Africa, which means that either he was killing his girlfriend, for whatever reason we don't know, knowingly that she was in the bathroom, or if he didn't know she was in the bathroom, which I don't believe, but if he didn't know she was in the bathroom, he thought it was an intruder, he was killing somebody black. So it's either black, it was either a race or a sex crime, as I discuss in the piece. So that's an example of where violence is an alternative to thought. They're alternatives, and they appeared legally alternatives to thought. The example for sexual harassment, I think, is really fascinating, because I don't think the harasser is thinking. No, he's telling his victim to think about him, right? You will think about me, which is to say, the harasser is destroying the autonomy of mental life of the victim. And the person who's written about this most brilliantly is Christopher Bolas in his essay on incest, where he says, against the tradition, which says that psychoanalysis never takes incest. Freud gave up on the seduction theory of neurosis. He didn't take it seriously enough. Most of his patients who were hysterics had actually been abused, right? This is the way that argument goes. And the analyst today will say, of course we take it seriously if somebody has been abused, but we think that's the beginning. It is not the end of the conversation. That's the difference. But what Christopher Bolas says is that when some patient comes to him and says, I've been abused, he says, my heart sinks. And he says, my heart sinks because I know that is all we are going to talk about for weeks, months, and possibly only years. And on that basis, he pedals back to the scenario when this person was abused and realizes that what a child has is a capacity for reverie. It's what all human subjects have. They have a capacity for reverie. If someone abuses them, brute reality lands on them in such a way as to cut that capacity off. It is so present. It's in your face. In your face means you can only think about that. You can't think about anything else. So for him, the trauma of abuse is that it shuts down the imaginative capacity of the mind. It gives it no freedom to range or to rove. And I think what I was trying to say in the book is that that's what an abuser or harasser is doing. They're saying you are not going to be free to think anything. And also what they're saying is, I know what you want. So I think we have to be very careful in all the debates over consent and everything, that we're not buying into a discourse about knowing what you want. No, I know I don't want you, but I know what I want. And Catherine Angel's new book that's just come out, Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again, which is a quote from Foucault, is precisely critiquing this category of consent and some of the problems around it, as is Amya Srinivasan, who has just taken up the Isaiah Berlin Chair in Philosophy in Oxford, and whose book, The Right to Sex, will be coming out any minute now. So there is a kind of pushback on that question. So I'm not sure if I've answered you or not. I've drifted off a bit.
No, I think you have answered the question, and probably Rebecca has some questions to you as well. I just want to say briefly, as you already mentioned, Amila Haas, and that question of mastery, specifically in Israel and Palestine, that today in the newspaper, Haas reports on the still lack of access to water, to clean water in Gaza. This has been the case since the round of bombings in May. And of course, there is a process of thinking by the master here that is taking place. And perhaps it's precisely the type of thinking that is already marked by violence, because Israel has intentionally barred entry of construction materials to Gaza, but that means that there cannot be a fixing of some of the water sources. So it's also an opportunity to mention, I got to know your work through my work on Zionism as a student, but it was also not an easy book. Your book on the question of Zion. It's not the only book in which you write about Zionism, but it's the only book by you that has been translated to Hebrew. And I think neither the right nor the left, whatever those categories might mean, could easily digest it. And a lot of that, I think, owed to psychoanalysis, which is, when Rebecca and I were discussing your work among us, as both of us have had a chance to teach it in our respective courses, whether on Said or on Proust. Psychoanalysis combined with other forms of knowledge or thinking is not always easy for the reader. And Rebecca, I know that you wanted to ask a little bit about that too.
Oh gosh, so much that I want to respond to in things that both of you have said. So a few things. Danielle, you're just sort of speaking about the indigestibility of psychoanalysis, which I think, it's perfect right down to the kind of eating metaphor in some ways. And also the kinds of strange ways in which that has to do with how we talk about, or how we speak, or how we attend to meta think, the act of thinking itself. So Jacqueline, you brought up this bit from Arendt, right? Think what you are doing, and it sort of it makes the appeal to psychoanalysis feel like almost kind of the perfect dialectical relation in some ways, because psychoanalysis is concerned with the unthinkable, right? What we can't articulate about our own experience, what we may not even know to articulate about our own experience, and about the way that what we don't know is kind of framed among these kinds of coercive rearrangements of desire, to twist a phrase from Spivak. And I think one of the things that you are asking in your work with this indigestible discourse is sort of about that fault line, where we kind of can't have, on the one hand, the fully kind of uncoerced rearrangement of desire, right? Another name for that might be education, right? But also that there may be some kind of give in the web, or give in the weave. And I guess the question that I want to pose on the heels of those observations is sort of about kind of the use of psychoanalysis and your selections of different kinds of texts. So psychoanalysis is something that we apply not merely to people, but to literature, and often in your reading to historical events. And I'm really interested in the way that you think about crossing these different objects with this immensely flexible analytic tool, and also sort of what complements you have found are kind of useful bolsters, or useful sort of I suppose discursive objections in a funny way to what psychoanalysis does. So I suppose that's the question really is just what are the powers of psychoanalysis for you among these different texts, and how is your relationship to those texts different depending on what corner of psychoanalysis you happen to be going to?
Okay, well, there's so much there in what you both said, so I'm just going to try and go through the thoughts that have come up as you've both been speaking. In relationship to Gaza and the lack of water in the Mira House, Miri Weingarten was the head of Physicians for Human Rights in the occupied territories for a while. And she's Israeli, and she's been part of a group that I co-founded called Independent Jewish Voices. And she said, I never forget this, she said, whenever anybody in Israel says the word security, everybody stands up straight and stops thinking. And I just thought that was such a beautiful encapsulation of the way the concept of security is misused to justify the militarization of the state, because she was talking predominantly about soldiers. I want to respond to, it's partly an answer to your question as well, Rebecca, but the question of the digestibility or not of psychoanalysis, especially in relationship to Zionism, is acute. Some people really hated the book because they thought it was a degradation of Zionism to treat it as anything other than the rational desire of minority people for self-determination and persecuted people for self-determination in their own homeland. And I would respond to that in two ways. On the one hand, I would say that can be true. That can be absolutely true. But we need a concept of overdetermination, because there is something about this struggle which is so intractable and so enduring and so obdurate that may well be absolutely true about the founding moment, but there's something going on that's not being spoken. And of course, what's not being spoken is the ethnic cleansing of 1948. One could say. But the thing that worried me was the idea that the use of psychoanalysis somehow degraded the project of Zionism. So when the book was translated into Hebrew, it was also translated into Arabic. But in the preface to the Hebrew edition, which felt so freaky because Freud wrote his famous statement about his Jewishness in the preface to the Hebrew translation of Totem and Taboo in 1930. And it was about 2013 that this happened, so it felt kind of freaky. But anyway, I just said it is crucial that it is a central parameter or principle of psychoanalysis, no one is ever degraded by the unconscious. And Freud's stated aim in the interpretation of dreams was to restore die Würde, the dignity of the psyche, by giving the dream the right to meaningful expression. So I think that cannot be said often enough, that, and it's not about the irrational psychoanalysis, it may be about the non-rational, but that's not the same as the irrational, right? Irrational means a bit crazy, unthought out, whereas the non-rational means a different way of being. I think a lot of this hinges on how you translate Freud's famous statement, wo es war, soll ich werden, which the James Strachey translation, I'm sure you know this, Daniel, so forgive me, translates as where id was, there ego must be. Now that gives the idea of the unconscious as a mess that the ego has to control, right? It has to take mastery of it. It has to sort of define, it has to know, this relates to your point, Rebecca, about the unthinkable. The unthinkable has to be thought. It has to be acknowledged. And then, and this is the wrong consequence, and then the confusion of the drives will be in some sense subdued. So you may well think psychoanalysis is about thinking the unthinkable, but the idea that then what you've done is mastered it seems to me to be the terrible mistake. Lacan retranslated it. There where it was, so shall I become to be, right? There where it was, so shall I come to be. So must I come to be? Soll ich werden, right? So he's suggesting that point of psychoanalysis to go exactly the opposite direction. There where it was, das Es, the unconscious was, I, das Ich, must come to be. I must go back in the other direction, into the unconscious. Okay, so that's one answer to, not an answer, but it's one way of responding to your question, which is it depends on which psychoanalysis you're talking about. And let me add some history here too. When Strachey translates where id was, their ego shall be, some people say that was the beginning of ego psychology in the America, which turns psychoanalysis not into an appendage of state power, but into an appendage of normalization of its citizens. That's one of the arguments in the 50s. Well, you have to remember that a lot of those analysts were emigre analysts from Nazism, including Ralph Lowenstein, who was Lacan's first analyst, and therefore a lot of Lacan's attacks are against his former analyst. And if you fled from Nazi, you may well think the fortification of the ego is your best bet. And you may well not find the more indeterminate, unstabling and unsettling version of psychoanalysis that I work with to your taste. So for example, it was an argument inside feminism in the 70s that to use psychoanalysis to talk about the radical this is before gender trouble, the radical destabilization of sexual identity through the unconscious, simply pushed, and the radical nature of hysteria as a kind of protest against patriarchy, push women back into hysteria and into the domain of the unconscious and into the domain of the unthinkable, which one whole set of Western cliches is only too willing to confine them as a way of blocking their access to power, authority, money, freedom. So you have to be very refined, not refined, that's not the right word. These things are not soluble, but you have to be alert to these different nuances. Now, when you talked about psychoanalysis and literature, Rebecca, I was intrigued because you talked about applying psychoanalysis. And I always give my students a little lecture about how what we're doing is not applying. We are not applying psychoanalysis. And what I give them to read, which I'm sure you both know, is 1977, Shoshana Feldman's famous essay, Turning the Screw of Interpretation, where she says, she takes Lacan's meaning indicates the direction in which it fails and suggests what you have to do in reading the text is go for the points which are illegible or are manageable in some way. So in the course I teach at Birkbeck, which is called Freud in the World, Psychoanalysis, Literature and the Legacies of History, we spend 4 weeks on Freud as a social thinker, Civilization's Discontents, Essays on War, Moses and Monotheism. And of course, they're totally thrown, the students, because they think Freud is about sex. They don't. So I say, okay, this is the proposition of the first 4 weeks. Freud is a social thinker. Our question is, what kind of social thinker is he? All right. Then we move into the literature of the end of his life and the Second World War, and then the partitions that happened at the time of that Second World War and as a consequence of it. So we read Rebecca West's Black Lamb, Grey Falcon, which is about a journey through Yugoslavia. We read Elizabeth Bowen's The Heat of the Day. We read Sebel's Austerlitz. And then we move to Israel-Palestine, because that's one of the three partitions that were the consequence of the war. And I say to the students, the proposition of the second part of the term is that partition is the non-psychoanalytic response to historical conflict. Discuss, right? See where you get with that idea. But I insist we are not applying the psychoanalysis literature. Your role is not to see where these literary texts echo Freud, because the literary text could be way more radical, complicated, and interesting than the literary text, than the psychoanalysis. But if we're talking about the definition of sexual difference, the definition of national identity, the corruption of civilization, and the violence of war, all the texts I put on the reading list are about the same thing. So the question is, they're treading the same ground. What is the difference between what they do and what kind of challenges might they pose to each other? So the last thing we're doing is applying psychoanalysis. As Shona Feldman says, that implies it's a master-slave relationship. It implies psychoanalysis has the key to unlock the literary text. And literary readings like that, psychoanalytic readings of literature like that are beyond boring. I mean, they're terrible, you know, right? So I know that's not what you were saying, Rebecca. I would love to know a bit more what your links between psychoanalytic literature and your teaching is, both of you, in fact, because I give them Darwish and Amichai, Danielle, and I give them Chizar's Chibetizeh, and I give them Facing the Forests and Return to Haifa. And so the point is to see what are these works going through alongside Moses and monotheism. Freud did not want the Jewish people to be one people. He thought they were founded twice. They thought that, you know, Moses and monotheism is, for me, a counter to Hitler because of what it fragments and how it dissolves itself and the difficulty of the text. So let's see what they're doing with the idea of national identity. So that would be an example of some of the links I'm trying to make, but it's very much in the students' hands at that point to see what they see there. But I have to, sorry, just say one more thing. Barbara Johnson, again, in that wonderful issue of Yale French Studies of 1977 that has Shoshana Feldman's article in it. It's about 50 years ago, right, I think. Barbara Johnson, who was a wonderful literary critic whose work I'm sure you know, she wrote on Zora Neale Hurston. She was absolutely extraordinary, and Nella Larson. And she just said that there's the content and there's the frame. And psychoanalytic readings or approaches to literature must talk about enunciation, who is speaking and from where, which is what Shoshana Feldman does with James's Turn of the Screw. What is the narrator saying, and how do they give us or take from us access to meaning, right? And she says, nonetheless, if you're thinking psychoanalysis and literature, you cannot avoid talking about the Oedipus complex of the characters or whatever. You can, it's a temptation that it is impossible to resist, right? So I'm giving a slightly purist version of what I like to think goes on in the dialogue between them. And I personally, just speaking for myself, I choose texts that I think talk to what it is I'm trying to talk about in other ways. So Anna Burns' Milkman, which I don't think was as successful in the States as it was in the UK, where it won the Booker Prize. And the year I was on the jury, and I was thrilled that we got that book through. It's about harassment, and it's about Northern Ireland. And what it does with that, you won't pick up from any other writing. And the point is, you won't pick up what these texts do to the problems we're facing from anything other than literary writing. I mean, I do think that.
Yeah, so that is, I'm so glad to have done my part to solicit such an elegant framing of the argument against application, which is very much in line with a lot of my own thinking about how, you know, there are many ways in which I think, you know, the relationship, to speak to that question, for me, between psychoanalytic thinking and sort of literary thinking, right, is that they're not the same, but they are both modes of inquiry if you approach them in a certain way. I do think that, yeah, it is not a stable relationship among among these different kinds of discourse. And I'm so glad that you brought up Johnson as well, who I think is just particularly stunning on that question in the stuff on abortion and apostrophe, right? In which we kind of understand something about the way lyric poetry is supposed to function, and also about the way that we think about this entity that we name the fetus, right? And that those things are in some way showing us different aspects of a kind of situation, right? Which is psychic as well as embodied, right? And as well as political, right? It happens on a number of different levels. So that I'm delighted to kind of have more language to frame that relationship when I'm thinking about it in the classroom as well. So I will maybe hand it over to Danielle, who I think might want to jump in.
No, I'm as intrigued as you are, Rebecca, especially as we both also wanted to ask you, Jacqueline, about how teaching is part of your work. And I think your answer now, in which you also listed literary works and in different languages as well, the different literary works that you teach side by side with psychoanalytical thought, as often texts do approach the very same questions, the very urgent questions. So you already answered in a way the question that we plan to ask you about teaching too. But as so many literary works have come up already, and I think one of the literary works that you analyze in the book that precedes this new book on violence and violence against women, which is your book on mothers, that's a question in its own right. How does one move from writing a book about mothers to writing a book on violence against women? And I think there is an answer to that question in the book on violence. But the question that I'd really like to ask you is about Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan Quartet in Mothers. I think it's a good example, and because it's such a popular literary work, those four novels, I'm sure that so many of the people who are now in the audience, faceless as they are, have read Ferrante. And you, in Mothers, at some point, you think about Ferrante's Neapolitan Quartet as an act of mothering. So again, it's in the book about mothers. And again, as it's many readers probably know, it is a quartet that gives form to a friendship in which the worst fears and the worst acts of violence can somehow only be dealt with through friendship. So it's a text about violence in its own right. It's a text about friendship through the lens of violence, or maybe violence through the lens of friendship. And once again, you define it as an act of mothering. Perhaps it's what the narrator of these novels does to her brilliant friend, Lila. And reading the book about violence, I was thinking, if Ferrante's writing about violence, and it's so obvious that it's writing about violence throughout, whether it's in the domestic sphere and acts of violence, in very loaded relationships like the mother-daughter relationship, or the violence of post-war Italy, of Naples in particular, of that lower class neighborhood where most of the novels take place. So if Ferrante's writing about violence is an act of mothering, what other forms do we have at our disposal for writing about violence? And how did you approach narrating violence in this new book?
Whoa. Okay. Violence as an act of mothering is a very interesting way of putting it, because I think there comes a point where I just say towards the end of my discussion of the book that there is a sense in which the whole thing could be seen as Lenu trying to save Lila, right? Because what I found so incredible as I looked through the book the second time, was that Leela cannot keep her boundaries together, right? There is the constant disintegration of her own corporeal frame in relationship to the objects that surround her, in relationship to the kind of ecological environment, in relationship to the cosmos, which is to say that she has a kind of Higgs boson privileged access to the mutability of the world, right? And if you read a lot of literature on motherhood, it is about the inability, well, not a lot, but some of the stuff that I've enjoyed most, like Kristeva's Stabat Mater. It is about the complete, she calls it a kind of socially licensed psychosis being a mother, because the boundaries between you and the other person are completely fluid and broken. And you cannot really disintricate yourself from the body and the reality of the baby. So it seemed to me, first of all, that Leela's capacity for connectiveness across the boundaries of things that are meant to be distinct and separate was not distinct and separate from her attitude, her being a mother, that somehow they were in intimate relationship with each other, but it was psychically intolerable. And I think it's very important to say that Ferrante really pushes as far as you can go on what is psychically tolerable and intolerable. And therefore, at the end, and I can't remember, I should have looked it up, but at the end, Lenny says something about her whole life having been an attempt to kind of hold Leela together in some way. So it's like in so many relationships, especially when you have a child, one person worries for the other person. You have to distribute the anxiety. If you both worry equally about the baby, you're going to drive yourselves and the baby completely crazy. So you have to have one who says, I'm calling the hospital now, and the other one who says, I think we should wait a couple of hours. And I remember a friend saying to me once, yeah, waiting for what? What are we waiting for the baby to die? You know, I mean, this goes on in so many relationships, which is the utter precariousness of a new life and the masquerade that you're somehow going to make it okay, and the reality that you can't. I did an interview for the book with Maggie Nelson, and she said, you can see it online. She said, she asked the therapist, is it okay for me to tell my little boy that it's not going to be okay? No, and the therapist said, that's a bit of a difficult question. So, well, maybe I can say to my little boy, things aren't going to be okay, but that'll be okay. You know, I mean, how do you deal with it? So I don't think it's violence as an act of mothering. It's mothering as in touch with the violence of human subjectivity in unique and extraordinary ways that are not often talked about, which is why I love Ferrante so much. Because the central thesis of the mothering book is so crassly simple. It is simply that the world is unjust and our hearts are frail and we're capable of violence of everybody. But mothers are meant to make all that untrue. They're meant to make the world safe and they're meant to be happy all the time. I mean, it's complete bullshit. And to be a mother is to know that in 3 seconds flat. Whether you've adopted your baby as I did, or whether you're a biological mother, you know straight away the world is unjust and your heart is complex, right? But mothers, I think, are then hated for not holding up the illusion, which is why we have at the moment what Julia Kristeva has called a feminicide, which is the amount of killing of women by men during the pandemic is extraordinary, especially because lockdown shuts women in abusive relationships back inside their homes, which was not commented on until the statistics started soaring, but also because with so many people dying, women cannot even pretend to sustain the illusion that they can make the world safe. So what I loved about Ferrante is as if she takes the lid off and shows the absolute internal chaos that is mothering. And this is the genius of Ferrante, makes this also part of, as you said, post-fascist Italy. It makes it part of what the post-war dispensation is when you've got that level of criminality coursing through the social body in a way that it's as if the mother is carrying the burden of that too, which comes out as violence against women in the home in the most tangible sense. So Ferrante for me was, she was a godsend, really. I mean, I just thought this is, because I read it once, not thinking about it in relationship to mothers, and then I read it again, I thought, oh my goodness, this is just astounding. And the violence against mothers, I should just say, is one of the untold secrets of the hour. I mean, I don't know what the situation is in the States, but 54,000 women a year are sacked for being pregnant or having babies in the UK. Technically illegal, but they managed to do it. 54,000. The book on mothers starts with the headline "From Here to Maternity," with a picture of a Black woman with 5 babies, being used to suggest that the threat to the National Health Service in the UK is from migrants. Black women, licensing vitriolic racism across the country. So I suppose what I was saying very simply is, you look at mothers, which is meant to be all sweetness and light. I mean, go into a bookshop and ask for poems on mothers and you will throw up, I promise you. They're so ghastly, most of them, only because they choose the bad ones. And I just thought, this is such a complete lie. And to be a mother is to suffer from that lie. So it's a situation of bringing violence to the surface and saying, as with Maggie Nelson, it's not okay, but it's okay that it's not okay. And the worst thing is to pretend it's not there. I mean, that's the argument of the violence book, is that the worst thing is to pretend it's not there. I'll just end on this. Marilyn Monroe said, "I am violent, I have violence in me." She was in therapy, you know, and she wanted that to be spoken. She was also very left-wing, but that's a whole other story. I'm not sure I've answered your question. I've just given you reasons why I love Ferrante. I'm not sure that's quite what you wanted.
I think you did answer also the question of how we write about violence and even why. Rebecca, I think we should maybe take some questions from our audience as well, if we have any. I think we have.
So I think we have about if you all have 5 more minutes to round off conversation, I certainly do, and let people sort of get their wits about them. Sometimes people don't love to submit questions until like the last 5 minutes or something. So it's good that I can give people that warning as well. Does that sound right to people? All right, wonderful. So yeah, I mean, I confess I was really intrigued also in your remarks on Ferrante, just thinking about like the incredible, you know, almost sort of heavy-handed, but also perfect symbolism of the dolls in that book, right? You know, we begin with the dolls at the very, very beginning, and you know how they sort of play a role in this incredibly sort of precarious and violent sort of world in which the girls are negotiating their own coming of age, and then they resurface at the end. Spoilers, I suppose. But you know, they seem sort of the kind of telling detail that speaks to what you've just been doing in your description of Ferrante, and that they sort of are a kind of reminder, right, of the possibility conditions for growing up in this world, right, which is that you have to have a relationship to motherhood if you're socialized female almost from the beginning, right? It's there in the forms of play. It's there in the way that you know, that violence itself is used as a kind of domesticating force in those novels. And just to connect that to the milkman example from earlier, I mean, that's a book in which you know, I think what's sort of, you know, both incredibly effective and also horrifying about it is that none of the characters are actually named, right? They are referred to by their roles in the protagonist narrator's life. So, you know, this is the little brother, right? And this is, you know,
the
wee mother.
Sisters.
The wee sisters, right, who sort of have their own little constellation. And with the mother, who is the object of sort of much vitriol and also attempts at understanding from this adolescent girl who is narrating to us, the amount of violence and you know, libidinal energy that goes into both sort of rejecting everything that this sort of worn out woman is, and also the immense amount of energy that goes into the almost violent, again, revelation of how somebody might come to be that, right? And how easy it is to come to be such a person, right? That is entirely a part of the design of the system. So speaking of the design of the system, I think this is maybe my my final question, I had a lot about kind of style and whether you feel the pressure to offer solutions in books that are so concerned with limning for us the shape of our unspeakable problems. But I think I mostly just want to ask, what are you thinking about now, or what kinds of new things did you discover in writing the violence book that have prompted for you new questions or new things that you want to think about, given, of course, that it is the height of vulgarity to ask somebody what their next book project will be. So please not to take it in that light.
Okay, no, I don't take it in that way at all. Two things I want to say is I'm going to go back a bit to some of the other points in your questions because they're so rich, both of you. Freud on dolls, of course, caused a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
Because Ernest Jones said, how can you not see the natural maternal instinct in the little girl's interaction with her dolls? And Freud insisted that what the little girl was doing with her dolls was carrying out on the dolls what the mother did to her. I say it was an act of affirmation and aggression and hostility. It was a very Kleinian moment in his thinking. All right, so I think it's really important to remember that mystification of the maternal possibilities of a little girl as a natural biological function, as opposed to a form of violent psychic playing, is, says a huge lot about the different ways you might want to think about psychoanalysis. I always say psychoanalysis, I think I say it somewhere in the book, has two propositions, which is life is harder than we would wish and we're all weirder than we like to think we are, right? So you just start with that, then I think you go quite a long way, because I think an awful lot of what's going on in the world at the moment that is so frightening is forms of rejecting what we're capable of. And I just want to refer back to 9/11. My daughter was 7 at the time, and I thought, what am I going to say to her as to why this has happened? It was the first time the world really intruded on her life, as in, this buildings have gone down, people have been killed, people are falling out of the building. And I thought, well, can I say to her that some people really hate America because of its foreign policy? Or must I say they attacked us for our freedom? Well, of course, I wasn't going to say the second. I felt it was absolutely crucial that she get the idea that the violence that had hit America might be explained also in terms of America's accountability and control and power in the world. She was 7. So obviously I didn't put it anything like I just put it to you. So some people don't like people who are very powerful and they don't like what they've been doing and, so on and so forth. But one of the newscasters in the UK, when he said this is a time for understanding, the hate response that he got, you're just meant to condemn, you're not meant to understand. So I think so much is to do with, and this is true also of Israel, that it can never see itself as the origins of its own acts of violence. It is always responding to violence from the outside. There's a psychoanalytic mechanism for that. It's called projective identification. You do not take responsibility for your own psychic act. So I think I would say, that if you want to say, what is the solution to all of this? It is to think about stuff in a way that includes your accountability for what you like least that's going on in the world. It's a kind of form of responsibility and vigilance. And creating the space, and the university is one of them, although there's a huge battle over freedom of speech in universities at the moment. And the argument for freedom of speech is basically an argument that you cannot disinvite people you don't want to speak at the university, which is in itself an assault on freedom of speech. So all the debates about woke culture and all of that, it's very, very unpleasant. But I still see the university as a place where certain conversations can be had, which is why I'm still in the university. What am I working on now? Well, there's a very simple answer to that. I'm working on Simone Weil. I don't normally have a simple answer to that question, I should say, because you're right about. Because I was asked to do it by the New York Review of Books, and I thought this is something I should really do, which is often how I write. So, for example, when the LRB asked me to write about honor killing or suicide bombing, or Marilyn Monroe, my first reaction is always to say no. And then what I call the feminist superego kicks in and says, for goodness sake, they have 75,000 readers. You're meant to be a feminist. You jolly well should know what you think about honor killing. You jolly well should know what you think about. It's kind of like do it, for goodness sake. So when, in the end, one of the wonderful editors of the New York Review of Books, of course, because there've been all these complex editorial changes recently, Jana Prikel said, what about Simone Weil? And I thought, this I can't say no to. This is, so I am immersed in her thinking. And it's a really difficult challenge because there are things in it I just love. And there are things in it which are very difficult to deal with. So whether that will turn, I don't think that will turn into a book. So I'm not sure what the next book will be. I've written quite a lot on the pandemic and on Camus' The Plague and Freud's relationship to the death drive when his daughter died of the Spanish flu in 1920. So I'm thinking that might be the basis for a book, but I'm just thinking around at the moment, which is a crucial part of what I like to do.
Yeah, and what a delight to hear a little bit about where some of that various thinking might take you, and it seems to me that it does actually touch on these questions that I think are very lively right now, even though there are questions about how we deal with mortality and the deferred mourning that is someday going to hit in some sort of social or political form, even though it is not yet with us. Thinking a lot about a Robert Walser dramalette, but that's a story for another time. So do you think perhaps that we might take a few questions? I think I have a few assembled here. Oh, many good questions from a document helpfully compiled by the glorious Elisaveta. So I'll just pick one to start, and maybe Danielle, you might pick one as well. I think we maybe have time for 2 or 3, depending. One doesn't want to tax anybody's hours. So let's see here. Okay, so I would love to start out with this question from Razak Khan. And it says, Professor Rose, could you speak about the question of violence against women in the highly polarized debate on the transgender debate on the category of woman? How might one deconstruct the category of woman through psychoanalysis without the question of violence at the heart of becoming a woman?
Well, the question of violence against trans women, I do discuss in the book, and I think it's very, very important because the amount of violence against trans women is really very scary indeed, and the amount of violence against trans women of color in particular. But the argument about the exposure of violence against women in the trans community and the argument that trans is the new human rights tipping point, which is to say that what is necessary is for the culture to recognize trans as something other than a pathological aberration, but as something that's telling the truth about human sexuality in one way or another, and in one way or another is crucial there, has been hijacked by the argument, certainly in the UK, I would say it has been at least partly hijacked by the argument that women, non-trans women, are in danger of harassment or abuse by trans women who are not really women, is how the argument goes. Now, this goes back to Janice Raymond's Transsexual Empire, a book of the 70s, again, I'm pretty sure, where she argued that the best emblem of patriarchal power, the best, was the trans woman who undergoes surgery because they have been willing to relinquish their genitals in order to achieve phallic power and authority, because they can then penetrate the community of women and hijack it or colonize it in some way. Well, as I say in my piece, this is a gift to anybody trying to explain the difference between the penis and the phallus, right? You'll be able to use this, Danielle, in your seminar next week, because they couldn't be more different if the condition of phallic power is that you remove your penis. I mean, you know, that is absolutely extraordinary. Now, at the moment, the debate is slightly different. It is that the only trans women who are allowed to go to the Hampstead Ladies Pond, for example, must be trans women who have undergone surgery, because otherwise they're just going to be voyeurs and troublemakers pretending to be women. So the lines have shifted, right? But the argument that, I mean, what's J.K. Rowling said, J.K. Rowling is very important here, because she said because she was abused as a young girl, she needs women-only spaces. Now, my heart goes out to J.K. Rowling for being abused, but I cannot accept the consequence of that as treating all trans women as if they were potential rapists, because they are not really women. And as I say in my piece, who's to decide who is a real woman or not? I mean, this relates to your points about authority. To think you can decide that, you have to be God or worse, right? To think you can decide who is real and who is not real. To say that trans women will not have had the same experiences as women who were gendered at birth, female, biologically, of course has to be true. But the category of the real woman is being used to exclude, not just exclude trans women from women's only spaces, but to create an atmosphere in the culture where trans women are a terrible danger to women. So a trans woman goes into a female toilet, she's going to abuse. In fact, the opposite is true. A trans woman is forced to go into a male toilet, she's going to be abused much, much more. So what I'm interested in, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, is that this question of violence, which is circulating in the culture around the question of trans, I feel it's a way of not wanting to find a way to land a protest grounded in fear. And the fear is to do with the mutability of sexual difference and what people can and will do to their bodies according to how they experience that. And I think it's causing panic. And I think these discourses and these acts of violence against trans women are symptomatic of that. In the same way as I say in the book, that one of the functions of rape is, one, to make the woman think about the rapist and nothing else, but it's also to classify the woman unequivocally as a woman, which is why I say at one point, all rapes are corrective rapes, not just the rapes of lesbian women. All rapes are corrective. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but it's a very searching one, and it's being so, I would love to hear a bit more how this is playing itself out in the States, because people have told me that you're not having this argument, that it's a much, much more easygoing atmosphere around this than it is. No, Daniel's shaking her head.
What some of the arguments around, or what we call turf, the
Trans-exclusive radical feminists. Same argument.
I think even anecdotally, even anecdotally, the fear of that very scene that you already invoked, of the bathroom, you know, the pond in this case, being somehow invaded by someone who's not cis. I think we see that in the US and beyond as well. What I find so enlightening in the chapters on trans lives in the new book is how you tackle those fears, and you show that what on the surface seems like fear of difference is also fear of the eradication of difference, of radical similarity, of identification, our own confronting of our indecisive position as sexual, as gendered beings, not to turn trans people into, you know, a redemptive force necessarily, but that subject of fear, as it is discussed in the chapters about trans lives and trans voices, and you listen to so many trans writers in these chapters, that I think is, you know, a must read, if I may. I know we're running out of time, and actually the next question that we have from our audience relates directly to those issues of our fear of our indecisive sexual positioning, gendered positioning. We have a question from Max Lockwood, who's asking about the correlation between anti-intellectualism or male ego and economic power and the broader world. And the question is, men have historically had physical as well as economic power. This too is changing. How is the change affecting mainstream male psychology? I understand this question as a question about the changes in male psychology. So thank you, Max.
Okay. What was the name of the first questioner? What was the name of the first question?
Razak Khan.
Rodzak. Okay. Am I right in thinking
Razak.
am I right in thinking our two questions have come from guys?
Possibly.
Possibly, but we don't know, right? Okay, I'm just intrigued by this. And of course, it's so complex, one can't even ask that question anymore, although in some senses one can. I hear behind your question, Max Lockwood, I hear, I don't think this is what you're saying, a classic trope, which is because of feminism, and I know this isn't what you said, because of feminism, men are now feeling insecure, and that is leading them to turn to certain forms of violence. Or because Chinese American men are not attractive to American women, it is understandable that they take a gun out and go and mow down, the incel, the involuntary celibates, the damage that's being done to them by changes in sexual preference and women's sexual freedom is almost a justification for the violence they resort to. Now, I know that's not what you're saying, but I think it's interesting that that whole argument hovers on the edge of your question, which in fact I see rather differently. And it's a very important question, which is men have the economic power and there's such a thing as the male ego. Is that the reason why, or can that explain male violence? Now that is pretty close to Catherine McKinnon's position and Andrea Dawkins' position, which is that male violence is an expression of inequality of power relations. It's a central argument to my book that it is up to a point, but that up to a point carries all the difference we need for a slightly better world. Because I think phallic power is fraudulent. And here I'm going to make a detour via Lacan, where he says, obviously he's been accused of being phallocentric, but he takes the statement of who owns the phallus, and he says, he is not without it, she is without it. Okay, that would be seen as a phallocentric statement. He is not without it, she is without it. And then he parses it differently. He says, she is without it, but without it, she is. I.e., she has an ontological status because she's not duped by phallic power. He is not without it, which means he has it, but he is not. I.e., his ontological status is unstable. So he reverses the relationship between power and phallocentrism. And what he's saying is that to think you're in possession of the phallus is a deluded state, which makes you think that your body, your sexuality, your desire, your economic privilege, and your power are a seamless thread. And my argument in the book is that this is complete nonsense. This is like the Wizard of the Oz behind the curtain. You pull it back and it's a little old man who has no power or authority whatsoever. And so I think we have to incorporate into the discussion of male violence fear at the fraudulence of phallic identity. So it's not that men are now losing power because women are taking over the world. I don't think that's right. I think it's that inherent to the ideal of male identity, which is in command, in control, self-masterful, without affect, is such a lie that it can only break, and it gets broken by projection. Just as when Kristeva talks about feminist side, what she's saying is that there is a frailty and a mortality, and one of you mentioned this, in human existence. And we're living a moment where we cannot deny it. We really cannot get away from it. Whereas people spend an awful lot of their life not really believing that they're mortal, and certainly not believing that they're going to age, right? Both of which things are unavoidable realities of who we all are. So I think it is a question of how you distribute the ownership of the pockets of insecurity and fear that I feel if you bring them to the surface, you're less likely to act in such a way as to try and wipe them off the surface of the earth. Which is why any claim to have had the war to end all wars is always the foundation for the next war. I don't know if I've answered your question. It's a really interesting one.
Yeah, thank you so much. So the question for us now is whether we have time for one more or whether we should call it an evening/afternoon. So
It's up to you. I'm in your
up to you.
hands.
All right. So I will consult once more the bank of questions. And this one is from Ayusa Lopez. Have you had thoughts on the interaction in the public sphere in re-masks and COVID restrictions and the bumping up against different opinions in re-bodily autonomy, rights, and the respect of others and our responsibility to others?
Oh gosh, have I had thoughts about it? Well, we're living it every day, all of us, aren't we? So I'm not going to have anything authoritative to say about that, except that the language about bodily autonomy and freedom and against goes hand in hand in the UK with the anti-vaxxers and the COVID denial. You will go into a public toilet in the UK and there'll be a note saying 99% of people dying today are dying of flu, only 1% are dying of COVID. You know, this is Agomba, right? Whose line is that actually COVID is being used simply to reinforce in an extreme guise the state of exception that we're living anyway. So in that context, arguments about bodily autonomy make me very uncomfortable because I think this is a time when we need to be operating collectively, when we need, as people like Etienne Balibar have been writing about and others, we need to revive a concept of the commons, which means our accountability is to each other. And it's very interesting on masks because if you wear one, you do not protect yourself, but you do prevent yourself from handing it over to other people. So we're going to see what happens now, but I'm afraid I'm a masker. And I also think, and this will take us on a long journey, but I also think in the UK, that the Prime Minister is someone who cannot countenance, and this relates back to Rebecca's point about grief, deferred mourning. He cannot countenance grief. He cannot countenance sorrow or hesitancy or not being able to get on top of things. And that's why we've had in Europe, we've had the worst death rate of any other country in Europe, because everything somewhere always got to be okay. I can go into a really vulgar psychoanalytic reading of why I think Boris Johnson is like that, but I will spare you. But I did find myself thinking, and I'd be interested to know what you think about this. Rebecca, given your point about deferred mourning, that one of the reasons why Joe Biden won the election was because he was a grief-stricken man. And that fitted with the ethos that the country needed somewhere, rather than I've had it, I've survived it, I've swallowed chlorine or whatever it is, and you know, and it's all I mean, terrifying the way that Trump dealt with the virus and catastrophic. So I suppose what I'm saying here is that bodily autonomy is fine, but I think what we should be doing is slowing the pace in the way that the wonderful doctor, palliative care doctor Rachel Clark writes about in The Guardian. Slowing the pace, confronting mortality, not moving too fast, and not making it a question of, to go back to the last question, of male egos wanting to show they can get on top of it. So I'm not sure if, somebody just emailed me to say, in fact, that in the States, you're not having the flooding of protests against the lifting of restrictions that we're having in the UK. And that therefore a certain norm of individualism and self-assertion and freedom to choose, of course, freedom to choose is central to abortion policy, but that whole ethos is not controlling the discourse in the UK, depending on what paper you read, the insanity of the lifting of the restrictions and going for herd immunity based on infection rather than waiting 2 months, in which case you'd have herd immunity based on vaccination, is all over the papers, that this is medical insanity. So I'm afraid I'm not on the side of the anti-vaxxers and the drop your mask and let's all be free. Very nasty version of bourgeois individualism for me. Sorry.
Wouldn't be a Bisser context, a Bisser event without some sort of suspicion or condemnation of bourgeois individualism. So I am so glad that we managed to sneak it in here at the end. I've been reading Spinoza this morning because I'm teaching Clarice Lispector tonight, and so one reads Spinoza to do that. He has this conception of freedom, right? That's about not denying or ignoring the so-called sad passions, but actually being able to think about them. Wow. And if you have been dwelling in the sad passions, for which, by the way, we thank you for that work, then I think you have also been giving us maybe a few signposts towards that more Spinozan sense of accounting for them. So this was just a delight. I am so grateful for your generosity, both you, Jacqueline, and Danielle. And I want to thank our audience as well, both for your attention and those lovely questions, and also Cora and Mark and Elizaveta and everyone at the Brooklyn Institute who invisibly in the background makes all of these events possible. So until the next time, good afternoon and also good night.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jacqueline.
Thank you both. Can we three stay on and have a brief word after this is, yep. Thank you. Thank you to the audience who I couldn't see.